It's definitely good to be back, and so thank you for having me to be able to address you this evening. And tonight what I want to discuss is we want to discuss virtual reality and idolatry. So where do we begin? Well, we can begin perhaps sometime in the early 1980s, and in particular we can begin with my childhood, which seems about as good a place as any, and that perhaps what I'm about to say doesn't make sense to some of you, but when I was a kid, I used to have a video game system, and it was called an Atari 2600. Maybe some of you remember that designation, or maybe have seen one in an antique store or something along those lines. But I can remember that it had ultra low graphics in comparison to the video game systems that now exist today. You know, it had Pong, so that it had two lines on either side of the screen, and you had a little controller, and a little dot would go back and forth. That was supposed to be a ball. And I can remember my brother and I thinking that, well, this is Pong, this is basketball, this is soccer. This is a number of different games because the graphics were so low that you could just kind of imagine what other sport it could be. Well, to say the least, technology since that Atari 2600 has certainly grown by leaps and bounds. These days we now have virtual reality where you can put on, for example, a virtual reality headset and go to all sorts of different places, experience flight, for example, without ever leaving the ground. You also have things like augmented reality, where you put on, say, for example, a pair of computer glasses, and it helps you as you look at the real world by looking at it in an augmented way, by giving you extra information, or perhaps if you remember a number of years ago, there was the Pokemon game where you would hold up your phone and search for Pokemon creatures. That's a form of augmented reality. Well, beyond that, in addition to these types of virtual reality or augmented reality experiences, we can say that we now have all sorts of virtual friends through social media, people that either follow you, say, on Instagram or on Facebook. And beyond that, we also can even create virtual worlds that are tailored to our own personal preferences. And so there's many ways in which virtual reality presents a lot of different opportunities for entertainment. There are a number of practical uses as well, but as we've been posing the question throughout these last several weeks in the evenings, we want to ask the question, what are the potential downsides? What are the things that we want to ensure that we avoid? And so what we want to do is first we want to look and consider the brave new virtual world, if we can call it that, and then after that, we'll take a look at the dangers, or say the real world dangers of virtual reality. And then we'll wrap up with a few concluding observations. So let's talk about the brave new virtual world. Technology expert Kevin Kelly, he has written the book that I have cited a couple of times. The Inevitable is what it's called, and it's the 12 new technologies that are shaping our future. He talks about the wonders of virtual reality, which he calls a fake world that feels absolutely real. A fake world that feels absolutely real. He says that you can begin to experience some of the burgeoning virtual reality technology, say, for example, when you go either to a 3D movie, if you've ever sat in on a 3D movie, or if you have sat in an IMAX theater where it's got that massive, floor-to-ceiling screen, and it's kind of almost encompassing you. He says that's where you begin to see some of where this technology is going. He likens the experience to an older movie, at least, if you've ever seen the movie. I'm not commending it, but he mentions it, the movie The Matrix, where the chief character, Neo, goes into the world, but this world is completely virtual. It is a non-physical virtual world in which he moves about and he goes from place to place. He runs, he leaps, over buildings, he battles enemies in this computer world. At least within the narrative of that particular movie, it feels completely real, and perhaps even hyper-real is the way that movie narrative describes it. To go maybe back a little bit further, I know that I haven't seen any of the episodes, but there's, I guess, a new Star Trek series that is out. I think it's called Picard. Well, you go back, to the Next Generation, which was a Star Trek show that was on a couple of, maybe almost 2 decades ago. But there was the holodeck, which was a virtual reality kind of experience for the members of the crew, where they could, in a sense, create whatever world that they wanted to on that particular part of the ship, and they could experience it, they could explore it, all while they were still on the confines of the Starship Enterprise. It was a simulation that was so real that things even seemed solid to the touch. Well, today's virtual reality isn't that advanced, at least not yet. But what Kevin Kelly says is it is definitely hurtling very quickly in that direction. You know, one of the things that my wife and I did, for example, when we were getting ready to move here, is we were in San Diego, just north of San Diego, and we spent a lot of time looking at houses online. You know, you looked at Zillow, for example, and in a lot of these real estate listings, we took advantage of what they called virtual reality tours. They were fascinating, where you could, with your computer, spin around and look up at the ceiling. You could look down, you could look all around, and then you could go from point to point in the house, and you could walk basically through the entire house, all on your iPad or all on your computer. You can use virtual reality for business purposes. When I first, was writing about some of these ideas, never in a million years did I think that we would be using that kind of technology with a vengeance as we do now, say with Zoom meetings, where you're not really in the same place, but you're able to turn on your Zoom app and you're able to have meetings even though people may be located in different parts of Mississippi or even in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. You can create virtual reality worlds. You know, where Kevin Kelly talks about it, where you can create a fantasy world full of unicorns or really whatever in the world you want to create and put in that world. There are other benefits beyond entertainment. Pilots, for example, have been able to reduce the amount and cost of training to fly because they fly in simulators. They can simulate engine malfunctions. They can simulate bad weather. I've been in one of these. If you've ever been in a really advanced flight simulator, virtual reality simulator, they're absolutely amazing. It's like when this thing, it was an airline, it was one for the airlines, and when I was riding in it, it felt like I was really bouncing down the runway as we were taking off. And then when we were taking off, it really felt like we were flying off into the sky. So in that sense, you can fly without ever leaving the ground. Another form of virtual reality that is really useful is, say, for example, how doctors in different parts of the world can perform surgeries in other parts of the world as they use robotic cameras. And so they don't even have to be in the same room, but yet they can operate on a patient that is literally thousands of miles away, all through virtual reality technology, perhaps even donning a VR headset. And then beyond that, say, for example, police officers can train in shoot or no shoot scenarios as they're in virtual reality simulators that present them with, different people. Is this person armed? Is he unarmed? Does he have a weapon? Does he have a cell phone? And it helps train officers in those ways. I think those are all of, say, the many positive things that we can say and find about virtual reality, whether it's for entertainment, whether it's for education, whether it's for business, or whether it's, say, for training, whether it's police officers or pilots. So I don't want to give you the impression that virtual reality is only filled with dangers. Okay? One of the things we're always trying to do in these series of explorations is to note the positive elements and the blessings in the technology that God enables us to develop. So those are the positives. But we do want to ask the question about what are the real world dangers, or we could even rephrase that and say, what are the theological dangers in virtual reality? And so we want to transition to this second point. Again, remember Kevin Kelly's statement where he says it's a fake world that feels absolutely real or absolutely authentic. What this means is that if misused, or perhaps used to excess, okay, is that this form of technology is driving a wedge between our minds and our bodies. It's driving a wedge between our minds and our bodies. Let me try to illustrate this particular point. Kelly, in his book, talks about his own experience as he was getting to use some really high-end VR technology in a computer lab at Stanford University in California. He says that as he donned this VR headset with the really powerful software and imaging, that all of a sudden, he said, it felt like he was walking on a beam, on an iron beam, on a building that was being constructed 30 stories above the ground. And he says he walked out on the middle of this beam, as he was balancing, and then he said he walked off the edge of the beam and he fell to the ground. He fell to the ground so that even though he was standing on the ground as I am standing, or he was as close to the ground as your feet are to the ground, the VR headset and the software and the virtual reality simulation was so real that his mind actually did believe that he was 30 stories off the ground, so that when he stepped off the beam, his mind thought that he was going to fall, and he lost his balance as he almost fell to the ground, and as the Stanford lab techs caught him before he actually hit the ground. Now, he would have only fallen literally as tall as he was, so it's not that he was really going to get harmed, or at least he shouldn't have become harmed. But this gives you the idea that at least really high-end VR technology, and this is the direction in which we're headed with this technology as it continues to develop and evolve, is that it drives a wedge between our minds and our bodies. It drives a wedge between our minds and sensing the world around us. Okay, sensing the world around us. And in fact, Kelly goes on to say this about the evolving nature of virtual reality. He says in the coming 30 years, he says anything that is not intensely interactive will be considered broken. Anything that is not intensely interactive will be considered broken. In other words, what will happen is that virtual reality will become so prevalent as well as so powerful that when you're not using it, it will make you feel as if the real world is insufficient. I mean, think of it. If you could create a world where you can quite literally fool your mind into thinking that it is real, well, then why live in the real world? Why live in the real world? It's almost, I think it's parallel or analogous to performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs or steroids, that if all athletes begin to use steroids, then what would happen is that performance levels and performance standards would begin to rise, so much so that if you didn't use the PEDs, you wouldn't be able to keep up. Now, supposedly sports agencies and organizations are trying to keep that from happening, right? But in other words, if you can put the world on steroids through using virtual reality technology and create the world exactly the way you want it, then why not do that all the time? Why not do that all the time? And so in this case, what I want to do is I want to pose three questions. I want to pose three questions, and we want to work through these questions as we think of this potential danger in terms of driving a wedge between us and the real world. First, the first question is this, are we trying illegitimately to close the gap between us and reality. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that, but are we illegitimately trying to close the gap between us and reality? That's the first question. The second question is going to delve into issues related to virtual reality, but specifically into virtual friends. Are our virtual friends, say those on social media, those friends that we think are a real part of our lives, are they genuine? Are they real? And then third is, I think, related especially to the point that we have just raised is, can we or should we try to divorce our minds from our bodies? Is this something that we should encourage? So let's consider that first question. Are we illegitimately trying to close the gap between us and reality? And that virtual reality, I think, is a context that it's an environment that is ripe for idolatry. Remember, an idol is anything that takes the place of God in our lives. Anything that turns our hearts away from God, that captures our hearts, our minds, and our lives. So to be sure, we can turn anything into an idol, okay? We can turn anything into an idol, but virtual reality provides, I think, greater access to potential sin. Think about it along these lines. When God first placed Adam and Eve in the garden, He gave them everything for their use. He said, of every tree of the garden you may eat freely. He says in Genesis 2:16 and 17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now notice what God does, is He places a gap. He places distance. He places space between Adam and Eve and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so God places things at a distance in our lives. And in this particular case, with Adam and Eve, He was testing them to say, will you legitimately close the gap by obeying my word, by heeding my command, and thus I'll give you access to the tree in a manner according to my will? Or will you illegitimately try to close the gap by disobeying my law, my command, and grasping of the fruit of the tree illegitimately, sinfully, and rebelliously? So notice, God puts the tree at a distance, and He challenges Adam and Eve, don't close the gap illegitimately. Close it legitimately. Close it according to my will. So if they wanted legitimately to close that gap, then they should have followed God's command and eaten of the tree only when and if God had permitted them to do so. But what did they do? They short-circuited the process. They illegitimately closed that gap, and they took of the tree and they ate of the fruit to disastrous consequences, right? Now, the tree of the knowledge wasn't an end unto itself, but it was ultimately a visual sign, and even theologians will call it a sacrament that said that fellowship with God had to be according to His will rather than our own. Okay? So would they close the distance between God and themselves legitimately or illegitimately? Would they obey Him and thus God would glorify them? Or would they try to seek equality with God as if it were a thing to be grasped, as Paul describes in Philippians chapter 2? Well, Adam and Eve resorted to an idolatrous substitute in their effort to close the gap. Well, with virtual reality, there's a temptation illegitimately to close the gap between us and reality. That's in a sense the whole nature of virtual reality. If you can't get to the Great Barrier Reef, you can't close that gap by traveling to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, you can close it through virtual reality. If you can't fly a plane because you don't have the money for a pilot's license, or because they won't let you do the things in an airplane that you want to do in the airplane. Take it for loops. Go high, go low. Well, then you can close the gap through virtual reality. Okay? In certain cases, closing the gap, say for entertainment purposes, is fine and legitimate, so long as, of course, we don't turn it into an idol. So these two examples are benign, but what happens when we become disillusioned with our lives because God's good creation seems broken? And it seems broken in comparison with the world that we have created. Or what happens when we try illegitimately to close the gap between us and something that God has said we should not have? You know, nowadays, and I won't go into the details, but say, for example, virtual adultery is going to become a problem, if it isn't already, where you can have virtual relationships, and somebody might think, I'm not committing any act of physical adultery. That's just one example of how we are illegitimately trying to close the gap between us and things that God has said we should not have, and we're using virtual reality, or we might be tempted to use virtual reality to do so. What God places at a distance from us for various reasons, we can now access through virtual reality. And so what can potentially happen is that the virtual world becomes an artificial substitute. It becomes an idol, like the athlete using steroids, or like the celebrity resorting to plastic surgery and then taking on cartoonish or distorted dimensions. Our virtual world becomes an idol of our making that points to our hearts rather than to God's good creation that points us to Him. Okay, so what about a second question? Are virtual friends real? Well, a danger with virtual reality is that we can forget very quickly that it isn't real. You know, the other day I was looking on Facebook. I have a Facebook account. I don't check it that often. My wife actually puts up content for me. And I do check it. And in fact, the other day I had to log in and I didn't know what my own login was. I had to look it up. And I noticed, I forget, my kids are very impressed because I have nearly, I think, 400 friends, which I know in Facebook measurement standards, that's not really anybody. That's not hardly anybody. You know, it's like I tell my kids, you know, they're like, wow, Dad, you have several hundred Instagram followers. I'm like, yeah, The Rock has like several million. Okay, I'm not successful in that way. But for those of us who really value all of those Facebook friends, for example, that number, or perhaps maybe we compare numbers. Hey, how many do you have? How many do I have? I think Kelly's example of forgetting that he was standing on solid ground illustrates this point. Might we look at that number and think that we are standing on the solid ground of genuine Christian friendship? You know? Now, true, don't get me wrong. Many of us can maintain connections to friends in the real world, say through virtual friendships or through our Facebook platforms or through social media. But one of the things that we need to beware of, say with virtual friends that come to us through this virtual world of social media, is that how much of what we're looking at is actually real. You know, I mentioned this, I think, in the first lecture that I delivered on screens where UCSD, University of Southern California, San Diego psychologist Jean Twenge has noted in her book, iGen, that depression, particularly among teenage women, is quite high in comparison with other users because they look at the pictures and the so-called worlds of their friends, their social media friends, and they wonder why their lives don't match up to how great their friends' lives are. How much of it are fake pictures? You know, how many pictures on social media are staged? And therefore not truly reflective of reality, but they're reflective of a virtual reality. You know, I've watched a number of videos that show people, and there's people taping people as they are trying to create social media posts, and they show how posed so much of this stuff is, how fake it is. You know, every once in a while you see celebrities getting in trouble for their social media posts because they have Photoshop fails. It's like, why is there a third leg in that picture? You know, that's one of the examples that I've seen. Then you do also have to ask yourself how much of the so-called social media friends that you're engaging with are really who they say they are. Kevin Kelly says someone may present himself as a lobster, but in reality, he's a dreadlocked computer engineer. I mean, we don't, you know, how much of it is genuine? How much of it is real? Criminals often use puppet accounts and have imaginary friends that have imaginary friends. You know, it was during the 2016 presidential election that Newt Gingrich boasted that he had more Twitter followers than any of the other candidates. It turns out that he had purchased about 3/4 of them. So how much is real? How much of it is genuine? How much is it of it, you know, how many of those friends are therefore genuine and sincere? Can a friend, and I can put that in scare quotes, can a friend on social media truly be a friend in real life? I mean, it is possible. Aristotle, famous Greek philosopher, says this about friendship. He says, in poverty and in other misfortunes, men think friends are the only refuge. It helps the young, too, to keep from error. It aids older people by ministering to their needs and supplementing the activities that they are failing from weakness. Those in the prime of life, it stimulates to noble actions, two going together. For with friends, men are more able both to think and to act. He's saying that a true friend sticks with you when you're suffering in poverty. A young friend can help you. If the young friend befriends an old friend, the old friend can keep the young friend from error. The young friend to the old friend can help the old friend as he is growing old and is incapable of doing certain things because of his advanced age. Notice how cross-generational Aristotle describes the nature of these friendships. He says, in the prime of life, genuine friendship can stir us to noble actions on behalf of others. In other words, how many of you have told a friend, I'll be there for you no matter what? Call me. Doesn't matter what time of day or night. Call me. In other words, real friends help each other through real world tragedies and challenges. They are supports and guides. Proverbs 18:24 says, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. You know, how many social media friends, because they're supposed to be genuine friends, really can stick with you through some sort of genuine tragedy? More so than just the, hey, I'm thinking about you. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I'll be praying for you, you know, or whatever the case may be. Proverbs 13:20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. In other words, if you make wise friends in the real world, they can have a very positive effect upon you. Or, of course, Jesus' own statement about the true nature of friendship. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Jesus is our greatest friend, and as such, he laid down his life for us. That's not a virtual reality kind of thing. That's a real world, flesh and blood kind of thing. So true friendship, in its most heightened form, occurs in the real world. But given our union with Christ, it ultimately occurs within the context of the church. Bannerman, in his massive, it was 2 volumes now, it's a 1-volume book on the doctrine of the church published by Banner of Truth. He says this: according to the arrangement of God, the Christian is more of a Christian in society than alone, and more in the enjoyment of privileges of a spiritual kind when he shares them with others than when he possesses them apart. So he says, we are truly the most Christian that we can be when we are a part of the church and when we enjoy the spiritual blessings of redemption together rather than separate. There's an added blessing on the fellowship of believing men one they cannot experience except in fellowship with each other. And within the bosom and the communion of the Christian society, there is an enlargement and augmentation of privileges not to be enjoyed apart from it. Such, for example, is the blessing promised to 2 or 3 when gathered together in the name of Christ, over and above what is promised to the solitary worshiper. So do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that we are most Christian when we are in communion with one another in the church. And I would say that that's ultimately a physical, real-world fellowship. We can restate Bannerman's point like this: we are most human when we are in physical fellowship with one another. And I hope, and I would suspect, that this is something that we have experienced in a very intense way over these last several months. I mean, nowadays, at least we're able to be near one another, at least with the masks. Although I don't know about you, they're starting to wear thin on me. It's just like, golly, I hate this thing. Glasses fogging up. It gets wet, after a while. You're just like, I got to get this thing off. But before that, how many of us were in the lockdown where we couldn't have gathered worship, and all of a sudden you realized, I really miss being in church? Whereas before we might think, you know what, maybe I won't go today. Maybe I won't go tonight. I'm kind of tired. Whereas now it's like, no, I think I'm going to go. I really miss that. It's because that's when we're most human, when we're in the real world, when we're gathered together with our real world friends. Christ has redeemed us to be a part of a body, a real world physical body, the church. And so we gather together to hear the preached word and to receive the physical sacraments, baptism with water, or the Lord's Supper with bread and the wine. And we participate in the fellowship of the saints as the church cares for the physical needs of its members. So to ask the question, should we try illegitimately to close the gap between things that we shouldn't have, that God has put at a distance? The answer to that is no. That's where we potentially create idols. Secondly, are virtual friends real? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. The best form of friendship, given our embodied, created nature and the fact that Christ has created us to be a part of the church, are our real-world Christian friends within the church. But then third and finally, can we or should we really try to divorce our minds from our bodies? The more that VR technology advances, the more it's going to try to drive a wedge between us and the world. But yet, think about it. If God communicates to us through His Word, the Bible, but as our Reformed confessions say, He also communicates to us through the real world, then what does that say to us? What does that say to us about secluding ourselves from the real world? I remember watching a news broadcast where they were showing pictures of what they believed human beings were going to be like potentially in as little as 50 years. And they were going to be potentially short, hunched over, and white and pasty because we never go out. Because we're always inside, on a screen or in front of the computer or in artificial light. I really hope that's not the case. Why? Well, because we should get outside. Why? According to the Belgic Confession says this in Article 2, and you can find similar statements in the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger and shorter catechisms. But we know God by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. And then second, of course, it says the Scriptures. So I don't know if you've ever thought of this, but when you look out into the world, do you think of that as a book that God has written to communicate His glory, His majesty, and His power, His omnipotence, His wisdom, and so on and so forth? And if we are driving a wedge between ourselves and the world by creating a virtual world of our own making, a world that ultimately rebounds and turns and points back to ourselves, rather than going outside and looking at the world that God has created and looking through the world to ultimately its creator, are we creating idols for ourselves? Are we missing out on reading the other book in the divine library that is the book of creation? Think about it. When you read a passage, say in Proverbs, that says, "Look to the ant, O sluggard." Go and kick over an anthill. I do that all the time with my kids. We'll pull up to church sometimes, and they're like, "Dad, check out this anthill." I'm like, "All right, hang on. Give me a second. Let me get my stuff, but let me look over here." I'm like, "All right, kick it over and then stand back." And we just watch the ants pour out of the hill. And in that, we can say, look at what God has done here with these small, tiny creatures, how He manifests His wisdom. When you read a passage in Genesis chapter 22, when God says, "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens," have you ever stopped, gone outside at night, and looked up to see, wow, that's the extent of the promise that God has made to Abraham? I can remember going on a run, and I typically run in the early morning hours. And, sometimes it's before the sun comes up. Sometimes I'm finishing up or in the middle of my run as the sun is coming up. And I remember one time coming around a bend and all of a sudden looking up and just seeing the most beautiful sunrise I'd ever seen in my entire life. And I even tried to take a picture of it. And I looked at the phone and I was like, I don't know what's going on, but that doesn't look like that. Maybe you've had that problem. Maybe it's just that I'm a crummy photographer and I have a cheap phone. But I was just like, and I literally began to say, that the heavens declare the glory of God. There is no language or tongue in which their voice is not heard. It goes out throughout the whole earth. Don't close yourself off from this beautiful world that God has created. And it gives you the opportunity not only to enjoy God's good creation and all of the blessings that He's given to us through it, but it also provides you the opportunity to praise Him for creating this beautiful world. Think of it in all of its beauty, its majesty, even if it's in a sin-fallen state. And then imagine how much more glorious the new heavens and the new earth are going to be if you can ponder such things as you look out upon this world. Think about it. If the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, did not have a body, Think of the Children's Catechism. God is not like man. He does not have a body like man. God is a spirit. God is a spirit. He does not have a body like men. So if the Son of God saw fit to become incarnate as an embodied human being, to live in the midst of this created world, what does that say about our very human existence? The goodness of our bodies, the goodness of this fallen but nevertheless beautiful creation that God has made, and how much we should go out and enjoy it. Now, I'm not saying that you can never or should never make use of virtual reality. I've given a number of illustrations and examples as to how we can enjoy it and benefit from it. But we should always be on guard to make sure that that technology never becomes a substitute for God's beautiful and wonderful creation that He has made. So just by way of conclusion, virtual reality has many uses in life. But the moment that we allow it to disconnect us from the real world, we run headlong into the dangers of idolatry. We can unconsciously diminish the nature of true friendship, or we can even perhaps unwittingly begin to drive a wedge between our minds and our bodies, our minds and the bodies that live in this creation that God has made. So never let virtual reality replace the good world that God has created and the things that are in it, whether it's the world itself, whether it's the friends in your life, or whether it's your own existence in a body. The good physical creation that Christ entered to redeem us is ultimately to a new future created existence, so that this world in its embodied nature is preparing us for the next world to come, the new heavens and the earth. Don't accept the poor substitutes, however flashy the technology may be, however useful it may be. Never let this technology come between you and God's good creation. Thanks.
Thank you.